Our speaker tonight is my professor, Dr. Paul Gould. He is not only the director of the Masters of Arts in Philosophy of Religion program here at PBA in the School of Ministry, but he's also the man and the mind behind this conference. So he's been putting this together for months now. He has students wearing these green shirts that he's riled up to help him put this show on. So we're really grateful for him. There's a lot of weight on his shoulders to pull this off, and we hope that you enjoy it. But he has his master's from Biola, Talbot School of Theology, PhD from Purdue University, the place that I know only to get the style guide for MLA and Chicago when I need to do that kind of stuff. He's the author of many books, which you can find outside, and maybe you could get some signed copies as well. Oh yeah, that was my last point. You could get your copy signed outside. What better thing? There's nothing better than that. But without further ado, I'm going to invite and please welcome Dr. Gould to talk on C.S. Lewis and stories.
Raphael, you're pretty good at that, man. Good job. So Raph is our Canadian, so you got to give him, a break, right? But it was fun. Last night we were all as a group. We have like an intensive this week that we've been running with the MA program, and afterwards, last night we went to Amici's, which is a little marketplace on the island, and we got some sandwiches, and we went to the beach. And Raph here, the Canadian, was fishing, and he snagged a pretty good fish there. So I was impressed. I was really skeptical, Raph, but good job. Okay, yes, I need to switch gears and try to remember what we're talking about here. So, which actually, Dr. Pryor set up perfectly, kind of with her very last question and the answer she gave, about reading books. It was actually perfect because so Ethel, my wife, is right here, and 10 years ago, we just celebrated our 30th anniversary this summer, but for our 20th anniversary, that was probably one of our all-time favorite vacations because we found ourselves in England, and I was actually in Oxford teaching on C.S. Lewis. And it sounds more impressive than it is. I was there on behest, not of Oxford, but of the seminary I was teaching at in Texas. But we were teaching about C.S. Lewis in Oxford. And for me, C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors. It was sort of an existential pilgrimage where I just did everything that I could related to C.S. Lewis and his life. And so I've got some fun pictures as we begin here, but of course, one of the first things we had to do, and I think we went like 5 times to the Eagle and the Child, which is the place where the Inklings would get together, and this would be J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and many other people that would come in and out, and they would share their writings with each other. And you would, and so like when they were writing The Lord of the Rings and the Narnia stuff, they would do it here in the Eagle and Child. And so I went there now. Their burgers are just fine, but it was still cool to go there. We also went to, this is the Kilns. It's called the Kilns. This was Lewis's home in Oxford. We went twice. This is the back of it. And I actually found out recently, I was asking about why is it called the Kilns? And evidently this land was a brick laying land, in the history prior to when Lewis owned this house. Beautiful house there. And in the back of this house, now some of it's been kind of is no longer there, but there was a series of ponds in the back of the house. There's 2 of them that are left there. There's this pond, and then there's another one to the right of this. And it was really neat walking through the back sort of woodland there and imagining all these ponds. You sort of get an idea of what Lewis was thinking about in which book. Do we have The Magician's Nephews, right? In the land between the lakes. And this is this pond, and then this is a bench that Lewis and Tolkien would smoke his pipe there, and they would sit and they would look at this pond. So that was fun there. Now, there's not actually many pictures of Lewis. There's a pretty small number of pictures, but this is a sort of famous one that's often thrown out there. But I did love the Kiln so much, I snuck back one time and managed to get back into his study. And I figured I'd have to, do the same. And so there I had somebody reach in and snap the picture from outside the window, but there it was. But yeah, again, just loved being there. After the couple weeks in Oxford, the whole group went up to Edinburgh in Scotland, and we did some things there. And then Ethel and I finally sort of broke off from the group and began our own vacation and celebration of our anniversary. And the first thing that we did in Scotland is we went to the Elephant House, which is where J.K. Rowling wrote the first Harry Potter book. And you walk into this. Has anybody been here? Okay, yeah. So you guys know this. I know you have too, Paul. Okay, cool. Yeah, so you walk into the back of this, and there's a huge bay window. And the view looks something like this. And walking back into this bay window, you start to imagine what J.K. Rowling was thinking when she's writing about Hogwarts. And you can see through the mind's eye what she's imagining. Just down the road from the Elephant House, you have Robert Louis Stevenson's home there, and it's now a museum. And we walked through that, and we spent some time thinking about, he's the author of one of my favorites, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as well as Treasure Island. And spending some time there, and then walking the streets in Edinburgh, you begin to get an idea of what Stevenson was thinking, especially in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as he talks about the city streets of London, right? You can kind of see through his eye. From there, and it's interesting, we didn't realize this, but what we ended up doing was a literary vacation of all of our favorite authors. And so from there, we went to the village of Haworth, where the Bronte sisters, so sorry, Ethel, you're in a lot of these pictures, right? So here we are, where the Bronte sisters lived and they wrote. And so behind Ethel there is the Bronte sisters' house that they lived in back there in the village of Haworth. And what was really cool about this is we basically had this 3-hour tour with this Bronte scholar. And right behind that house is the moorland. And we walked this for hours with this scholar, telling us all about the Bronte sisters. And I can remember walking through the moors and imagining or seeing through Emily Bronte's eyes the landscape that fills the background of Wuthering Heights, right? From Haworth, we spent a night at the bed and breakfast of the estate next to Jane Austen's home. Here it is, in the village of Chawtow. And this is near the Alton in Hampshire. And so we spent some time here, and we walked her grounds. This is actually the table and the pen that she wrote Pride and Prejudice with, and so it's kind of neat to see these things. And then that night, right across the street from this house, is the estate that was, I think her uncle, it was the benefactor that provided this house for her. We stayed in the estate, not the estate, there it is, there's Ethel again, but there's the background. We stayed not in that big, estate, but behind that was the kitchen house, which is bigger than our house. And we stayed there in a little bed and breakfast. But again, walking the grounds here, we can see what Jane Austen was thinking when she's writing about Pemberley, right? And Mr. Darcy, and things like that. And you can kind of see through her mind's eye. From there, we went to Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare lived and wrote. And then we spent a few days in the Lake District. This is where William Wordsworth lived and wrote his poetry, as well as Coleridge, who Dr. Pryor mentioned earlier. And this is me, you can see they're walking these crags. They call them crags, but they're these beautiful hills. They're not quite mountains, but they're these beautiful, green and lush hills. And you can see, again, how the poets were inspired as they walked through all this beauty. And so as we walk through this literary tour of England, following in the footsteps of all of our favorite authors, I noticed something taking place in my heart, right? As I was nourished by the beauty, as I was nourished thinking about some of our favorite stories and the lives of some of our favorite authors, I realized that my soul was stirred. And it was stirred, and my imagination was stirred, and basically this longing to live this dramatic life. As we walk these sort of ancient streets and well-worn trails of Lewis and Tolkien and Wordsworth and Austen and the Bronte sisters. And all of this leads us to what I think is a really provocative thought, okay? So here's one of my new favorite authors. Has anybody read William Kent Kruger? Okay, one? Yeah. So if you haven't, this is a good place to start. This is a 2019 book, I think, called This Tender Land. And this particular book, which was a New York Times bestseller, is basically like a Huck Finn meets Homer's Odyssey kind of mashup story. It's a kind of journey story. But I was caught and snagged within the first paragraph. Because here's what he says at the end of the first paragraph. He says, "In the beginning, After he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and the sea, and all living things that dwell therein, after he created man and woman and before he rested, I believe God gave one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. That's a provocative thought. And I love this. Stories are a gift. And of course, like everything else in the world, it's a gift to remind us of the source of goodness and truth and beauty. And so I want to explore this provocative thought, right? To look at stories theologically and to think of them as gifts. And of course, we have to use C.S. Lewis as our foils, one of my favorite authors. And so what I want to do, sort of the goal for this time, is I want to give 3 Lewisian observations about story. And from there, I want to give you a Lewisian-inspired account of stories, and specifically good stories, and then we'll give you some practical applications, and then we'll have some time for discussion, okay? So that's the plan of attack here. So we're going to kind of transition with this provocative thought in mind to some of the things that Lewis says. And of course, Lewis has a lot to say about a theology of story. So let's begin with the first observation. Observation number 1 is that humans are, narratival animals. So we're narratival or living, storytelling animals. So here's, in 1945, in the collection of essays called The Weight of Glory, Lewis wrote a little essay called his Theology Poetry. And in that particular essay, he's exploring the connection, actually in relation to the earlier talk, he's exploring the connection between the imagination and theology, asking this question, is theology poetry? And in there he says this. He says, man is a poetical animal and touches nothing which he does not adorn. And touches nothing with which he does not adorn. In other words, everything we touch, we adorn with meaning, right? And that actually reveals the deep intuition of the human heart, that the world is coherent, that reality is rational, that it's intelligible, that it's meaningful. And so the idea is, or this idea that humans are essentially story listening, storytelling, and story-making creatures is an idea that many people have noticed. Sociologists, philosophers, historians, and literary theorists like Lewis have all noticed, as well as philosophers, that humans are storytelling animals, that humans are narratival animals. And in many ways, this has like the ring of deep truth, I think. And you might ask, however, if we're storytelling, story listening, story making animals, like why? Why are we poetical animals? Why are we narratival animals? And Lewis, as well as J.R. Tolkien and Chesterton, all give the same basic answer. And the basic answer goes something like this, right? And it'll be a very familiar answer, right? We're storytelling or story-making creatures because we're made in the image of a storytelling God, right? God has created this divine drama with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we, take up our place as image bearers and live our lives according to stories as well. So let me give you some examples. So Lewis, in this essay, Myth Became Fact, also written in 1944, you can find this little essay, which is important if you're interested in a theology of story. In Lewis, you can find that essay in God in the Dock. But he says, if God chose to be mythopoeic and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? So I'll come back to this particular essay at the end, right? I love what I love what Tolkien says. In 1939, he wrote this famous essay on fairy story. One of my favorite phrases from this is this quote, this line, he says, we have this kind of enchanter's power. I love that sort of idea. That we are sub-creators, as he says, that create in the derivative mode in the image of the maker. And I love the passage. So Tolkien says in that essay, he says that in terms of this enchanter's power, he says we have this power to remove green from the grass and blue from the sky and red from the blood. And he says in the stories we tell, to tell stories of blue grass and red sky and green blood. And he calls this a strange and wonderful power, and a power that's unique to man. Probably one of my favorite quotes from Chesterton comes from the book The Everlasting Man in 1925, is also very provocative. He says that art is the signature of man. That would be a really interesting thing to explore. Art is the signature of man. Alone among the animals, man is shaken with this beautiful madness called laughter, as if he has caught sight of some secret in the very shape of the universe, hidden from the universe itself. Okay, so my first Lewisian observation is that about stories is that we're poetical or narratival animals, right? So we come into this world with the sense that we're part of an ongoing story, and of course we take up our place in that ongoing story as we listen, as we make stories, and we live our lives according to stories. Okay, first observation. Second observation, stories uniquely reveal meaning. So Lewis endorsed, in the philosophy of arts, Lewis endorsed something that we call aesthetic cognitivism, right? So this is a theory in philosophy of art. And it's the view that one of the chief functions of art, and in this case, one of the chief functions of stories is to communicate understanding, right? It's to communicate insight and real knowledge about the human experience of God and the world that we find ourselves in. So in 1947, he wrote, so I'm giving you like 5 of the really important works on theology of story in Lewis. And so in 1947, he wrote this essay on story. And you can find it in this collection of essays by Lewis. And in there, he begins to kind of unpack his own definition of what a story is. So he begins this way. He just says, stories are series of imagined events. And then he goes on to say, it must be understood that this series, the plot, as we call it, is only really a net whereby we catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or quality. And then he gets to the end and he says, in life and in art, as it seems to me, we are always trying to catch in our net of successive moments something that is not successive, rather something eternal. In other words, good stories reveal deep truths about prime reality, right? It's kind of think of it as pulling back that curtain and glimpsing reality as it is. That's what good stories do, right? It's a kind of net that's catching these eternal truths, okay? So that's something called aesthetic cognitivism. And by the way, so I love how Dr. Pryor talked about the imagination. For Lewis, he famously called the imagination the organ of meaning, right? So if reason is the organ of truth, or the natural organ of truth, the imagination is the organ of meaning, right? And so so for Lewis, the idea was that we perceive the world around us, but that perception, these sensory perception of the world is received by the imagination. The imagination helps us understand it such that we can deliver these understandings to reason, to judge as true and false, and then we can act according with our wills, with the good. So the imagination is the organ of meaning. And that's why, for Lewis, when he wants us to understand the difference between the modern word, space, which he hated, and the correct medieval word, the heavens, he tells a story. Right? You might know the story. He tells a story of a Cambridge Don who's kidnapped, right? And he is sent on a spaceship to Mars, right? So that we would understand the meaning of the word heaven. And that's why Lewis, when he wants us to understand the nature of spiritual battle, tells a real fisticuff story about a battle between that same Cambridge Don and the devil, now on Venus, in a story called Perilandra. And that's why Lewis, when he wants us to understand the dangers of moral subjectivism, he tells us a story about a cosmic battle between good and evil in a quaint English town called Belbury in that hideous strength. And so, of course, you know what this is. It's kind of interesting. You can't see it there. It says here the beloved space trilogy, but Lewis hated that, right? Because space is the very word he didn't want us to use, right? The proper word is heaven. So call them the ransom trilogy, is what they are. Closer to home for us, a couple years ago, before we lived in Florida, we lived in Texas. And when we first moved to Texas, I wanted to understand, what does it mean to live in a town that organizes itself around football, right? Football is huge in Texas. Their stadiums are bigger than some college stadiums for their high school. And so what I did was actually read this book, Friday Night Lights. Not the show, but the book. It's not fiction, it's actually nonfiction. But in reading that story, it helped me to understand what it's like to live in a town organized around football. When we moved to Florida 4.5 years ago, I read this book. Has anybody read A Land to Remember? Yeah. So this is a historical fiction book about the settling of Florida. And in reading this book, it actually did help me understand the kind of forces that were in play in the settling of southern Florida, right? And so Lewis would put it this way, and Dr. Pryor already sort of referenced this, I think, during the Q&A time, right? But this is one of my favorite quotes from his book, An Experiment in Criticism. He says, in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see him with a myriad of eyes, but it is still I who see. So stories reveal meaning, and they help us to understand. And that leads us to our third and final observation. And this is about the gospel. The gospel is the normative story for every human being. So normative means like ruling, so like the ruling story. So if we were going to riff on Tolkien, it'd be like the one story to rule them all or something like that, So the gospel is the normative story for every human being. So if you think about it, since we live according to story, since we live on stories, the question that we might be asking is, well, wait a minute, is there a story that's alive? Like, is there a story that understands us? And of course there is, and the answer is the gospel story. The gospel story is the true story of the world. And C.S. Lewis, there's this famous quote by Lewis that actually is a beautiful quote because it illustrates the pre-conversion mindset. And it also helps us to see how in Christianity and Christianity alone, we have this perfect blend, as one person put it, of reason and romance, right? In Christianity alone. So for example, before he was a believer, you can read about Lewis's autobiography, his story, in this book, Surprised by Joy. This quote here is a often quoted, often referenced quote because it shares kind of his mindset prior to Christ. And you can hear the struggle and the angst here. He says, before he was a believer, the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest of conflict. On the one side, a many island sea of poetry. On the other side, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So it was Lewis's discovery of Christianity that actually helped him to unite the two aspects, the two hemispheres of his mind, right? Christianity is the perfect blend of reason and romance. So alone, as he would put it, so actually let me go back to, this is the quote that I started reading to you earlier from Myth Became Fact. So this is the last sentence in that short little essay. It's about three or four pages long, the whole essay. But here it goes. If God chose to be mythopoeic, a story-making God, is not the sky itself a myth, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? And then he goes on to say, for it is this marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each of us, no less than the moralist and the scholar and the philosopher. So in Christianity alone, you find this uniting of head and heart, of reason and romance, of the abstract and the concrete, of the true and the mythic, right? Christianity, as Lewis puts it elsewhere, is true myth, true story. It's the normative story by which we understand all the lesser stories, including the story of our own lives, okay? All right, so we've got our three Lewisian observations here, and that leads to what I'm just going to call the Lewisian-inspired definition of a story. So this is a kind of tentative definition, but here it is. It's kind of based on, I think, a lot of what Lewis has said. So a good story is a dramatic account that binds together ideas and events and images and agents into an intelligible pattern in order to reveal deep truths about prime reality, right? It's catching this net of eternal truths, right? A good story does this. Now, a few observations about this definition. Actually, I can come back to this slide, but let me give a few summary observations here. So stories are ordered accounts that reflect the order and coherence of existence itself. And I think they provide, as one writer puts it, a way of us seeing in the dark, right? Our storytelling nature reveals to us, and I think, and implies that our experience of time is not incoherent, it's not meaningless. And, like so in the 1960s there was the so-called theater of the absurd, the existentialists, but I think they got it wrong, right? I think Calvin was right when he talked about the world that we find ourselves in as the theater of God's glory, right? We have this kind of intuition that reality is intelligible, it's coherent, it's meaningful, and that leads to our next observation. Stories have dramatic qualities to them, right? Action is always part of a story. They link action, they recount struggle. Here's one, you ready? This is a really big one, but it's actually super important. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yes, they do. But notice what the beginning, middle, and end do are actually pointing to the fact that stories explore three interrelated questions about identity and about meaning and about purpose, right? They ask the question of origin, where do we come from? They ask the question of destiny, where are we headed? Where are we bound? And they ask the question of quest, how do we get there, right? So it's these questions of beginning and middle and end. These are, of course, the questions of creation, destiny, and quest. And so to understand the story of a person's life, like a literary story, we can actually judge whether a person is a wanderer or a pilgrim, right? Because a wanderer lacks direction, whereas a pilgrim is guided by hope and the conviction that there is meaning to be found. Think of like the difference between Homer's Odyssey or maybe Pilgrim's Progress versus like a David Foster Wallace in Infinite Jest, right? Where it's just wandering and there's existential angst and things like that. Now, stories usually address a problem to be solved, and they usually have like three stages, right? They have this, in the beginning, in the origin story, it's usually like this initial state of bliss. So you have a kind of Eden, or a paradise, or an Elysium, or some kind of, home. But then a journey is often initiated with some sort of a conflict, right? And then after the successful hero's quest, there's a kind of resolution. There's a kind of homecoming, a kind of rebirth, or a resolution that's achieved where all are known by their true name, and there's a happy ending. And that all leads to what I'm just going to call our big idea. And that's this. Stories reach toward theological understanding, right? They reach toward primordial beginnings of the universe, of our species, of our own lives. They reach toward the pilgrim's quest, and they reach toward the end of all things and the renewal of all things. And so our job as theologians, as philosophers, as apologists, as lovers of stories, right, is to make these connections between the stories that we read, the stories that we love, and these truths that they're reaching toward, okay? All right, so there's a little bit about Lewis, a little bit about story. Let's do some practical stuff, and then we could just use the rest of our time to talk about stories, Q&A. So here's 4 practical applications related to story. The first one is, and maybe, this is just important to say, I think, like, read good stories for the sheer pleasure that they bring, right? Like, it's pleasurable to read stories. Now, I will say that Lewis distinguishes 2 kinds of pleasure. Actually, in his essay On Stories, he talks about what we'll call mere excitement and what we'll call the pleasure of the quest, right? These are 2 kinds of pleasure. The first one, mere excitement, he picked on the Three Musketeers. That was the one that he would pick on. I think for us it would be, or like for me, it would be like The Bourne Identity or a lot of the Marvel movies. I don't know. They're like things that are really fun to watch or read about, but then you just forget about what the whole point of it was, like the day later, right? There's a lot of that. But that's okay, right? There is a kind of excitement or pleasure to those kinds of stories. And Lewis thought that was valuable in and of itself. But he did say there is another deeper kind of pleasure that we'll just call the pleasure of the quest. And this was like a richer, better kind of pleasurable reading of stories. And this was aroused when you explore the deeper parts of the imagination, right? It's aroused when you enter into these imaginary worlds, these secondary worlds, and you enjoy its scenery and enjoy its characters and the plot and the adventure and the whole atmosphere. And this is why we want to go back to Narnia or to Middle-earth or whatever the favorite sort of world, the secondary world is, right? For me, it's Narnia. For some, it might be Middle-earth. But for me, it's Narnia. Like, we want to continue to go back. And by the way, Tolkien and Lewis both had a really rich theology of these secondary worlds. In fact, Tolkien, one of my favorite things that he says in his essay on fairy story is that That these secondary worlds weren't about possibility primarily, but about desirability, right? That we're awakening longing. And so what they're doing, like when you want to always go back to Narnia, or you want to always go back to Middle-earth, or pick your favorite like secondary world, what they're doing is awakening longings for these other worlds so that we will awaken the longing for the only actually other world that we can go to, which is the kingdom of God, right? So they have this really rich theology of the imagination. And so for Lewis, this was the deeper quest. I put Lord of the Rings, but we could put the Narnia stuff there too. This was the pleasure of the quest. So the point is, read, and you can watch, but read good stories for the sheer pleasure of them all. All right. Second practical application is read stories to understand your culture, right? The imaginative fiction of a culture reveals what is currently experienced as important in those cultures, right? So think about like when, for example, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and basically to influence the nation and the country and others to the horror of slavery, right? And it actually galvanized the nation. Today we read of The Hate You Give, or The Underground Railroad, or Infinite Jest, to learn about the realities of injustice, or racism, or the human angst of the disenchanted world. And so I would say, so part of what I've done then is to read off of the New York Times best-selling list every year, right? And there's actually two benefits to that. Number one, they're probably going to be pretty good books, right? Usually. And number two, you're also being keyed into what culture currently thinks is important. And so read these stories so that you can have conversations with those in culture and understand what's important to them. Okay, that's number two. Number three, practical application is that we can actually use stories in our evangelism and apologetics. So I've got two books here that you can see, but what's interesting in the apologetic world is there's actually this kind of movement, and it's even interesting, we didn't plan it this way, but if you look at the number of talks, even here, a lot of them are connected to this topic of story, right? Dr. Pryor talked a little bit about the imagination. There's going to be a talk tomorrow on the argument from stories to God that's going to be fantastic from one of the most brilliant philosophers that's out there right now, Josh Rasmussen. But there's lots of work being done right now in theology and in philosophy with the importance of story and in apologetics. So you've got this book by Alistair McGrath called Narrative Apologetics. And the whole point of that was that you can use stories in your evangelism and your apologetics. And he talks about how engaging stories runs around the watchful dragons of the mind, right? And kind of gets to the heart and the emotions and the imagination. This other book here is by Holly Ordway called Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. And Holly was a kind of pretty hostile atheist, an English professor, but through reading the canon of English literature, she heard the voice of God and eventually found her faith. And so she's talking about how we can use the imagination to nourish the heart and to help us understand the meaning of it all, right? So we can use stories in our lives and in our evangelism and apologetics. And then finally, locate our life in God's story. And so one of the ways that I've noticed, I've shifted kind of in thinking about story, thinking about the gospel. I've shifted in, a lot of times I'll go and I'll speak on apologetics-related topics, and I'll be asked to speak on, does God exist, or why does God allow evil, or all these kinds of things. And I do that, and we'll still do all the normal philosophical stuff. But I've started to couch it with these kinds of questions. Questions at the front end of the talk, like if I'm talking on the problem of evil, right? You kind of drill down to the question beneath the question. And the question beneath the question is, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. That's the intuition beneath the question, right? This isn't the way the world's supposed to be. But the question beneath the intuition is there a story of all the competing stories out there that understands me, right? Is there a story that's alive and well? And we do know the answer to that question is yes. The gospel story is that story. As Lewis would put it, it's the perfect marriage of perfect fact and perfect myth, as well as the place to stand and a story to live on our journey. Okay. Oh yeah, so I got self-promotion. So I have a podcast. And if you're interested in the Ransom trilogy, you can go to season 6. We spend a whole season talking about all of the fun things that Lewis is doing there. just Google Podcast and check out season 6. And then this is an old slide because it's not November 2022. But anyway, you can get this book outside. Yeah, I know, thank you. A Good and True Story where, again, trying to, in a more imaginative way, take readers on a journey, right? Where you blend image and idea, stories and arguments to help people see the goodness, truth, and beauty of the gospel. So you can check that out in that as well. But that's all I've got. So we've got 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Let's have some time to chat. And Raf's got a microphone back there. So thank you.
First takers. Oh, over there. Okay.
Up front. Run, Raf,
Let's go.
run. No, you don't need to run.
Well, thank you for such a great message, Dr. Gould. I love C.S. Lewis's materials as well. And I think of some of his materials like The Four Loves, right? One of my favorite authors, her name is Kelly Needham. So she said in one of her books called Purposeful that it does the soul great therapy to realize even how Christ is like the main character in our own stories even. And so I wanted to know, especially based on what Lewis says, so for example, the four loves, that, for example, our soul finds a friend in Christ, so that friendship love, filio, I think it is.
That's right.
What does it do for the soul to really understand where we are in God's story?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What does it do for the soul to really understand that we're part of God's story? Right, I love that. So a few thoughts. One is, it reminds me of this wonderful, beautiful line in Calvin that I referenced here, but let me give you the whole line. So Calvin in the Institutes, he says, when we look at the heavens and the earth, so there's the language, right? The heavens and the earth, he says, we have this sense that it's a dazzling theater of God's glory. And that's a beautiful line. And it points to the fact that we're part of this divine drama, right? And that the main actor in there is God, but that we find ourselves as characters within that. And so that's one thing that's sort of beautiful about this, that we are a part of a divine drama. And I think we have that sense, right? So even in philosophy, there's so many thoughts to your wonderful question. Even in philosophy, there's this debate about something called narratival realism. And it's this idea that we do live according to a story, and we ought to live our lives according to a story. So it's a really interesting debate. Some of what Josh is going to say tomorrow is connecting to this idea that reality is a kind of ongoing story. Connected to this idea of love, though, is really interesting because, as it turns out, on the Christian story, the highest good for humans is to be united to love itself, which is God, right? That we are created for union with God. So there's the objective highest good. And as it turns out, the subjective deepest desire of the heart, as Augustine and Lewis would put it, is that we are restless until we find rest in God. So the deepest longing of the human heart is for God. The highest objective good is actually God himself. And so you see, again, in Christianity, this perfect blend, right, of created in love and created to be united to love as well. And so, yeah, I think that's the whole beauty of the gospel story. And so, yeah, I hope that's just first pass, but I love that question. Yeah, really good. Yeah, Daniel.
Hi, Dr. Gould. Thank you so much for speaking tonight and all that you do for so many of us. And my question, actually, two questions. One is, what are you excited about that Jesus is doing in your life personally, or that you see God doing in Christendom at large? And secondly, do you have any new projects coming up, or anything, books,
Okay.
or any kind of project
Thanks,
that you'd
Daniel.
like to
Yeah,
share?
those are fun questions. Yeah, so I love that. So what am I excited about? So Ethel and I and the kids read John Mark Comer's book this summer as a family, Practicing the Way. And which is he's a really good writer, and he's kind of distilling some of Dallas Willard's thoughts in a really powerful way. And one of the things that he talks about in there, and so kind of convicted me to kind of begin to move in this way, is to kind of craft a rule of life, and which is a very ancient practice that's rooted in Scripture and just kind of wise living. And so I've been sort of working on crafting that. And one of the rules that I'm have been thinking a lot about is this idea of, so here's the rule, I have like 5, but one of the rules is to seek and savor beauty daily in art and nature. And so I'm trying to incorporate that as a rule of life every day. And that's been really good, and that's connected to the second question, that you asked. What are some things that I'm working on? So I'm finishing up a philosophical theology textbook, so that's the current project. But that's going to be another summer till it's done, since I write in the margins, which is summer for us, because it's so busy during the school year. But after that, the very next thing that I want to get to, and it's all charted out and ready to go, is a book on reenchantment, and helping us to see and delight in the world the way that Jesus does. And so in an earlier book, Cultural Apologetics, which I know that you've read, Daniel, but you can get it at the back, I talked about how we can join with God and each other and the Holy Spirit to reenchant the world. And part of what I meant by this is that we would, number one, learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does, and number two, invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And that book, that was two future book projects. This book that's on the screen now was for that second idea, learning to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. The one that I want to get to as soon as I finish this other project is the one for us, for Christians. How do we see and delight in the world as Jesus does? And so it's going to be on reenchantment and things like that. So and it's going to be connected to beauty and story and art and all that stuff. But yeah, thank you for asking. That's what I'm excited to. But got other stuff to do first.
And that book is outside for sale, just letting you guys
Ralph
know.
and those guys are keeping me busy, so yeah.
Is Arthur Conan Doyle on your list?
Say that, Mike?
Arthur Conan Doyle?
On my list?
Of favorite authors?
I haven't actually read a lot of his stuff, sorry. No. I know I should, but can't read it all. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Gould. I have a question. It's you had said Christianity is a true myth. Do you think you could elaborate on that? Because it kind of, to me, like the statement in itself contradicted itself. So
Yeah.
if you could explain that
that.
a little more, I would
Good.
appreciate
Yeah,
it.
because of the word myth, right?
Yes.
Like that's fiction. Yeah, I love it. So that phrase is actually Lewis's phrase, true myth. And you can find it in right after that quote that I read earlier from Surprised by Joy in his autobiography. Yeah, so for Lewis, he's tapping into the classic word, the sense of the meaning of the word myth, which is story. It's just the thing we've been talking about today. So myth is just a story, and for Lewis, stories are these series of imagined events, plots, that are nets to catch and reveal deep truths, right? And so that's all it was for him. So there's many stories that are out there that we're seeking to live our lives, and there's only one story that's the true story. So that's all the true myth is, right? It's the one that's the Christian story, the good and true and beautiful story. That's all it is. That's all it is for Lewis, and that's all it is for me. Yeah, but that's good. I'm glad you asked, because that word myth we do associate with fiction. And then Ralph, I see in the back after that too. Yeah. Hey.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to bring up just one thing. I know you brought up a lot of good points, but the practical applications, specifically the last one, locate your life in God's story. How important is that in not just reading, because of course we do that, and we try to at least do that in all the other books that we read, but how beneficial has that been, I guess, not only for your life, but your family as a whole, just putting yourself or putting your family in that lens?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's the whole game, right? That's the whole ball game. If it is in fact the one true story of the world, then it's everything, right? And so it's everything for our family. And I think the challenge is not to just live in the story, but to stay in the story, right? Because there's, like I said, there's all these competing stories out there. Consumerism, even some of the things that Dr. Pryor talked about earlier, like even the American dream is a kind of narrative, a kind of story. So it would be like consumerism or hedonism. These are other competing stories, right, that are constantly challenging. And so I'm just reminded of this phrase that Calvin says about the human heart. He says that the human heart is an idol factory, right? That that we need to continue to kind of push these idols out of our hearts. And the way that we do that is by continuing to come back to this sense that we find our identity in the one true story of the world, which is the gospel. So yeah, it's a daily leaning. I spoke in chapel this morning, and the kind of thing that I left the students with was like, would we just get up each day and be men and women who say, God, would you help me to lean in the direction of you each day, right? And I love that phrase because there's this real grace in that, right? Of course we're not perfect. Of course we're going to mess things up, but can we just lean in the direction of God? And that's kind of how I would think about living in the story, the true story of the gospel. So, thanks.
Where was that hand in the back?
There? Yeah.
Hi. In the last one, she mentioned that perception is the ground for imagination, but on this one, we also mentioned that with that perception, it comes from stories and experiences, and that's how C.S. Lewis actually leads people to Christ. How can you help others be led to Christ if they have a different perception on who he is from their own stories and experiences?
Yeah, good. Right. This is the challenge. I'm going to switch the language just slightly. But the challenge is that we find ourselves, so like Dr. Pryor mentioned Charles Taylor, and he wrote this book called The Secular Age, and it's a big, like 900-page book. But for him, the secular age is the age of contested belief, right? So belief in God, if you go back 500 years ago, as Taylor would say, belief in God was automatic, right? Everybody believed in it because they imagined themselves as part of a sacramental or enchanted world, right? And so belief in God was automatic, and unbelief was really hard. But fast forward 500 years, today it's the opposite, right? Belief in God is not automatic, and um, and believing in God is more difficult for us, right? Because we live in a disenchanted world. So there's the language, right? And so there's this language of disenchantment and needing to be re-enchanted. And it's the idea. So theologians actually talk about an idolatrous way of perceiving today, that we perceive the world in a disenchanted way, and that we're actually perceiving it, we're emptying it of its magic, to put it one way. We're emptying of it of its transcendence. And so part of what we need to do then as men and women who want to share the goodness, truth, and beauty of the gospel is to help others see the world aright, right? So we see the world around us, but it requires interpreting. And that's part of our job, is to help others interpret. So that's that book that I actually want to write, is that we would see and delight in the world the way Jesus does, and then we would invite others, that's this one, invite them to see and delight it. So it's going to take work, right? Because we don't live in a culture where everybody sees this sort of sacramental, enchanted view. That's what's so hard about this age that we find ourselves in, yeah. So great question. That's why we got a lot of work to do, yeah. I see Dan, and then back there. Hey, Silas.
Okay.
Either one, wherever.
Sweet, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gould. This is really, really good stuff, and kind of perfect timing because our community group is actually going through Mere Christianity right now. We're
Nice.
getting to the end of it, and in that he uses his like fair share of reason and like thinking in that. So, in your experience or through your research, how do you know when it's best to use reason and evidence versus using story and truth in like evangelism or even just in discipleship?
That's actually a really great question. And I'm so glad you asked that, because for Lewis, I think he shows us the way. So think about Mere Christianity. Think about his sort of nonfiction works. Every time he begins a nonfiction work, he begins Mere Christianity, in the first chapter, he begins with something very familiar to all of us: two people arguing, right? And from there, so he engages our imagination in something that we all understand and mean, right? And then from there, he engages our mind and begins articulating over the first 5 chapters a pretty good account of the argument for God, for morality, right? And that's kind of how Lewis does it. So he engages the imagination and then engages in what I would call imaginative reasoning. And so I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and, that in all of our reasoning, we need to engage in what I'm going to call, or what many people call, imaginative reasoning. So we engage both, right? We help them to understand. And it's kind of like, if you think about it, maybe 50 years ago, if we had, imagine going to FAU and, you saw these advertisements for, maybe a Christian ministry had an advertisement: come hear what Jesus says about forgiveness for your souls because of your sin, right? So I've just used like 5 Christian words that mean nothing today, right? It would be kind of like if you walked around on this campus and there was flyers saying, come hear what Zeus has to say about, the earth, or the Flat Earth Society has to say about the shape of the earth, right? You'd be like, that's ridiculous. I don't care what they have to say. It doesn't mean anything, and it's ridiculous. Well, that's kind of how a lot of things sound to those outside of the faith today. And so we have to engage both, right? Imagination helps us understand the meaning of these words, but we're engaging the mind, reason as well at the same time. So yeah, so Holly Ordway, one of those books that was up there earlier, she uses that phrase, imaginative reasoning, and I think that's the model that we see with Jesus. We actually see it with Paul, and we could go through that if you'd like, but you see that in almost all the examples in the gospel, so it's both and, yeah. Especially in the day and age we find ourselves in now. So good question, Silas.
Thank you, Dr. Gould.
Two things I was going to say is, one, what you said about Lewis first engaging the imagination to then help us to understand. Just a comment. We also see Jesus doing that. And you said earlier in chapel, Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived, and reminded us of that, and how easy it was to understand such lofty and important topics through the way Jesus did it, which was mostly through parables and stories. And we see Lewis doing that, the whole book, at least Mere Christianity, just like metaphor after metaphor after metaphor, constantly engaging us to help us understand something that's lofty, that maybe it was written as propositions, may not have been as gripping for us because we weren't using our imagination to see how it happens in everyday life, like two people arguing. Comment done. Okay. Question was, at the very end of your presentation, you talked about the question underneath the question, and this desire for someone who's perhaps not a person of faith, wondering where their story is and if there's a story out there for them. And I was just wondering if how would you show them or convince them that it is a story and not just an explanation, some facts, this happened and this happened, and now here I am after these facts. You know what I mean? Like, why would you convince someone who would say, that doesn't seem like a narrative, that just seems like an explanation? So yeah, I think that's
Yeah, right. Good, especially if, because we live in I don't know, maybe it's not postmodern, but whatever the kind of disenchanted secular culture we find ourselves in, there's a lot of confusion about whether there is even any coherence to reality or any meaning to be had, right? So that makes this question hard. But I do think there's clues, and this is what I would say, there's clues that people have. When you see the things that people are drawn to, it reveals a deep longing of the heart, right? So we're told that there's nothing beyond this world, yet we love stories about things that are extra mundane, even whether it's like zombies or werewolves or vampires or whatever. These are extra mundane things, or paranormal, right? There's a huge interest in the occult because these are extra mundane things, right? Or even 5 years ago when we had this 15 minutes of everybody chasing little Japanese creatures on their phones, right? Mythical creatures, right? This was an augmented reality, something beyond this world, right? And so those are clues, though, that reveal the deep longing of the heart for something beyond this world, right? And so I would press on those. What does that longing reveal about the human heart? And one of the things that I think is really interesting about culture today is that there's this real, and I'm really excited for Rebecca's talk tomorrow, who gets to name us, right? So there's this real question or quest for authenticity. This is the buzzword today, right? You just need, that was follow your heart, as Disney would say, or, that was the real you, or something like that, or be all you can be, right? But the question behind that, or the intuition, or the quest behind that is this question, who gets to name me, right? And I think that in a rampant individualistic culture, everybody thinks that we get to name ourselves, right? But that's not the gospel. The gospel, we actually learn that we can't name ourselves, that we must be named by another, right? That's exactly what Matthew 28 is, that we're baptized into the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's a naming event, right? And so I think that we look for these pressure points in culture, whether it's the quest for authenticity, which Charles Taylor writes a lot about, but you see it everywhere, whether it's these longings for transcendence that are revealed through the movies and the stories and the things that we're drawn to, even though the intelligentsia tell us there is no such thing, right? And that's what I loved about, sorry, I'll stop. But what Tolkien in the essay on fairy stories says is we all long for this one kind of story. And this kind of story has 5 things. This is why it's so great in that essay. He says we long for a supernatural, he said a magical or even supernatural world, right? He says we long for death to be cheated and love to be eternal and for victory to be snatched out of the hands of defeat and a happy ending. These are the 5 things we long for. But then he says, but the intelligentsia tell us that there isn't any of that, right? There is nothing beyond this world, and that death is final, and victory often it goes to death and the bad stuff. But yet we still long for it in the stories that we're drawn to, right? And so he's going to press, so Tolkien presses that and presses that point to argue that, well, these stories that are good stories actually reveal prime reality and the deep longings of the heart in a way that the world of our experiences don't always do. And so, so we're going to have to just continue to press the way that Jamie K. Smith puts it, there's all these cross pressures that we find in our lives. Like for those who are not believers, we're haunted by doubt. For those who are I think it's for those of us, like we're haunted by doubt, and we're also haunted by this intuition that there's something more, right? And these are the cross pressures that we can press on. I hope that got to your question, but yeah. All right, we've got like 3 minutes, so yeah.
Thank you. So you stated earlier that a story is a net that captures experiences that mirror eternal truths. So when meeting somebody new or interviewing someone or trying to figure out someone's story, whether it's their own personal testimony or something that they're doing or working towards, what do you think are the best questions or the best tools to help build that net that captures their story?
Oh, yeah. Best tools, so we could switch to one way that Lewis would endorse here and a lot of his writings is to ask this very simple question: what is it that you want? Right? So Jamie K. Smith, he talks about how that was like Jesus' first question in John. If you look at the Gospel of John, that's actually the very first question he asked the would-be disciple. What is it that you want? And he says this is a question underneath every question that he asks throughout the Gospel. But that's actually a really good question, right? In this secular age, in this disenchanted age, it's kind of that runaround, right? We do need to get to the question of truth. Any cultural apologetic, any apologetic worth its salt has to walk that plank of truth and argue that Christianity is true to the way the world is. But there's all these questions whether Christianity is true to the way the world it ought to be, right? Is it really satisfy the deep longings of the heart? And that's where Lewis and actually Augustine and did so well on the desires and the longings. And so what is it that you want? But not just like, what do you want for dinner, but like, what do you really want out of life? Like, press that question, And even ask questions like, what does it take to be patient for that longing? And those kinds of questions will surface the deeper longings of the heart. And I think in surfacing those deeper longings, you're going to find the longings for goodness, truth, beauty, happiness, meaning, identity, all the stuff that the gospel story ultimately finds, I think, a satisfying answer. So I would press maybe that way. Yeah. All right. It's time. So thank you all. I'm so glad you're here. We'll see you tomorrow morning.